Hello there and welcome to J Painting. I am JJ, and what do we do on this channel? What is going on this here channel? Well, I'll tell you what's going on this here channel. We talk about the hobby. Sometimes it's a book review, sometimes it's a painting tutorial, sometimes it's just a retrospective on the hobby as a whole, and sometimes we're painting entire battle companies that cost us less than 100 quid. Not very often, but we do sometimes do it. But today we're talking about something which is quite personal to me in a way, or at least a distinction that I've been thinking about a lot, and that's the difference between a hobbyist and an artist. Now, most people who actually engage with the hobby would call themselves hobbyists, but hobbyist is quite a broad term which doesn't just apply to this hobby, and we're going to dive into that a little bit more, but also perhaps one of the reasons why people separate hobbyist from artist, when just about everyone who engages with this particular hobby paints, which surely would make them artists, right? But we'll be talking about that today. And for today's video, we're going to be painting this model right here. Yes, indeed, a very artistically heavy model, as they all are. But in any case, let's crack on. Okay, so before we get too far into this, let's specify what I mean by the term hobbyist and artist. Now, hobbyist is obviously quite a long-reaching term because it literally does just mean a hobby you engage with. So that's not just tabletop gaming or tabletop painting. That could be things like fishing, ice skating, anything really, and obviously painting too. But obviously it's quite broad-ranging. Whereas an artist, I think in most people's minds is a more specific thing. It's someone who engages with a creative outlet. And with artists, I think as a whole, it's probably worth thinking of them not just as people who paint, but also as people who sculpt, who sing, who act, who write. These are all people who could be considered artists as well. But what we're going to do today is we're going to ring fence all of those definitions within the idea of the hobby that we know, tabletop gaming, with a building, painting and gaming element. Now, obviously, it's worth remembering that when it comes to Games Workshop specifically, that has the three components of building, playing and gaming. But when we move over to something such as Magic the Gathering, that's just a card game, so there's only really the gameplay aspect of it. And also when we then move over to some of the other tabletop games, such as Star Wars, X-Wing and Armada, those models are pre-painted, so they have a very minimum painting and even quite minimal building aspect as well. There's not a lot of conversion opportunities to do with those models. But ultimately, when it comes to most of the rest of them, such as Games Workshop systems, Malifaux, Star Wars Legion, they do tend to embody all three of those concepts. When we talk about artists, what we tend to mean in our own minds is someone who does all those things like I said earlier. So the first thing I want to say is that a key area of separation that I think happens is putting the two of them in different boxes. A hobby is something you do to relax, something you do to take your mind off things. It's something which is more personal to you but can obviously be shared as part of a community. Whereas an artist almost seems like a job title, even though in many cases it is, but it's definitely at least a vocation in the minds of most people. And that's also fine. But I think it's probably worth mentioning right now that artists have their own communities as well. Sometimes they are a little bit harder to find and sometimes they are quite specific in terms of what they do. So it can be a little bit harder to understand exactly what they're all getting excited about. But artistic communities can be quite big and quite far-ranging. And I think the other thing to bear in mind when it comes to separating hobbyists from artists initially is that not everyone takes both seriously. Many people who simply just want to play the game that Games Workshop puts out there will often buy fully painted armies or pay someone else to do that for them, and that's absolutely fine. Whereas there are people who just paint those models. There are artists who don't play any of Games Workshop systems, but will buy maybe one or two models and put them on the shelf as part of a larger collection of something else, and that's absolutely fine as well. But I would like to very quickly start with artists, very specifically. I do think that when it comes to talking about artists here in the 21st century that we find ourselves living, unless you're watching this in the 22nd century, in which case, hi, YouTube survived this long, amazing. But anyway, when here we are in the 21st century, I think there is definitely a somewhat negative connotation to the idea of artists. I'm sure many of you have heard that phrase, there are too many artists in the world, and I'm not going to get into that debate because that's not what this video is about, but I generally think that that idea is something that has become quite prevalent, and it often makes people who do pursue artistic hobbies, for want of a better word, shy away from the idea of thinking of themselves as artists. But the other thing I'd like to be very specific about is many artists I know are actually business owners, they're entrepreneurs, they're very forward-thinking, time-conscious people who are very, very hard-working. Now, that's just me personally, and I don't necessarily know if everyone knows people like this, but it is worth mentioning that not all artists, in fact, very few artists I've ever met, tend to follow the stereotypical image of what an artist is. Most of them are actually very much the opposite. But the zeitgeist has its way of twisting these things. But in any case, I think it's probably worth saying that on that note specifically, it's easy to drive people away from thinking of artists as something which which is either serious or something which they can identify as themselves. And also there is obviously the much bigger question of what do we think is art, which is obviously very subjective. Now, this can range from anything such as a canvas which is covered in white paint, which some people will vehemently say is not art, and then you get lots of other things such as sculptures made out of tin foil and string, which other people also insist isn't art. But then obviously we're going to think about Games Workshop side of things, and obviously this isn't just Games Workshop, this is also things like Malifaux and Infinity and a lot of the other companies who in many respects have made the artistry side of things, such as the actual painting, as easy as physically possible. In fact, I have said in my previous videos that Games Workshop has done all the work except paint the models for you. And what I mean by that is they've created an enormous range of paints that all go on at different points in the painting process. They've done many different guides, many technique guides, and obviously when it comes to painting something that's already sculpted, a lot of the detail is already there. It's just down to you how you want it to be fully realised. So obviously, if you're painting something like a plague bearer, you're not sculpting the horns, you're not sculpting the sword, you're painting it. You can do a lot with that, but ultimately the contours, the shapes are already there. Unless you want to get the green stuff and scalpel out and start resculpting it, but that's a different matter entirely. And then on top of that as well, it's worth remembering that there are so many colour schemes that are so intrinsically tied to the game. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing at all. Having lore and gameplay brought together the way Games Workshop and many other companies bring it together has always been a good thing, and it's always been quite appealing for a lot of players. But that does, of course, then raise the question of where does the expression come into it? And this is what I mean by artists. Artists tend to be people who can express themselves through what we consider to be an artistic medium. And all those things I said earlier, such as writers, dancers, actors, as well as painters and sculptors, all have their tools and all have their ways of doing it. And this is a really important distinction I think that we need to remember about artists, is that artists as expressive people can tend to convey quite a lot. And I'd like to take our minds back to my metal models video from a few months ago, when I said that back in the days, at the height of metal models, a lot of people would see metal models as a base. They'd get their metal model initially, and then out would come the plastic art, and out would come the green stuff, and they'd start literally building custom models. Now, obviously, that was all still under the branch of the hobby, which is quite a nice umbrella term we used to describe everything. But when people would finish those models, those completely new models that they'd customized and worked to oblivion, when we think about those, would we see them as intrinsically art? Because you got to remember at this point, even though they are following quite a specific set of aesthetics, these models were customized, sculpted and painted by one person, and we would look at it and say that's a nice model, that's a nice conversion, that's a nice kit bash, but we'd never see it as that's something which has artistic value inherently. Now, I would say that all of Games Workshop's colour schemes do have artistic value inherently, as do all of the other systems out there that follow this idea. And the other thing to remember with this, just to very quickly before I sum up this point, is that just because GW have done it in a certain way doesn't mean that's the only way you can do it for yourself. You can do any other colour scheme that you want on any of their models. And I think it's always worth remembering, like I said with the Plague Bearer earlier, even though they've sculpted it a certain way, you can go back and resculpt it if you want. And I do think that in terms of the artistry of Games Workshop's models, that's something to bear in mind. So to summarise, it's very easy to start questioning what is art when you yourself may not necessarily feel like you're creating new colour schemes. And things that don't relate to the hobby necessarily can easily sometimes be dismissed as not having any artistic value. But at the same time, an equally valid argument can be made when it comes to just replicating colour schemes done by someone else for the sake of gameplay. And this is where I want to hit this point very sharply on the head, is that this is kind of where I think it's easier to fall into the idea of being a hobbyist rather than artist. Because even if you are just doing a colour scheme that you like, but you're doing it more for gameplay reasons than for artistic reasons, that's easier to put under the umbrella of the hobby in most people's minds, rather than having to say, this has artistic value because I've done it. Now, I know that's a very dense point and a slightly academic point, but I think it's worth mentioning at this point anyway. But this brings me on to my next point as well, and we keep on this idea of modelling and kit bashing. And this goes back to the era of orcs. Now, orcs have been around for a very long time, but as some of you may remember, the early days of kit bashing or converting orc vehicles, where you would literally take entire other vehicles from other ranges and rebuild them to have the ramshackle, junky, very brutal look of the orcs. But I think it's worth remembering that this was also only ever seen as part of the hobby. It would be very rare to see someone's converted Land Raider or converted Eldar Fire Prism and say, that's an artistically interesting kit. And people would say, that's a nice conversion, it's a nice kit bash. Again, the language we use around it says it falls into this very specific box that it's going to stay in for all and sundry. And again, I don't think there's anything incorrect about that, but it's interesting again that we put it in those boxes. And now at this point, I'm sure you're wondering, Josh, how does all this fit with the idea of separating the artist and the hobbyist? Well, this is kind of where we have to take a step forward in terms of all this. Everything I've said so far has been about replicating colour schemes that we've already seen, and then not necessarily acknowledging the things which genuinely are a little bit more unique to certain players. But again, we see them as fitting into under an umbrella of the hobby. We don't necessarily see them as an artistic expression of the player, because obviously they're used for the game purpose. And again, this is kind of where we start to circle into the point, is that because it has a purpose in the game, its purpose is to be part of the hobby. It's very hard to just see it as art for the sake of art in some respects, even though you could argue that's partly what the hobby is in many respects. An army, a fully painted army on the tabletop, is an artistic project. It may not necessarily be an artistic project that you can't see someone else paint somewhere else. And even though I believe that every single army that's ever been painted, every model that's ever been painted, makes the person who's painting it an artist, even if they don't acknowledge it, when you put it under the banner of the hobby, it's very hard to see it as something with artistic value whilst you're engaging it with the mindset of this is going to be used in the gameplay. So I'd like to use the Blood Angels for a very quick example at this point. When you're painting your Blood Angels army, no matter how advanced you are as a painter, you're painting it with the mindset of going, I've given each model this bit of equipment, each model has this colour, each model can therefore do this and that in the game. It has a function, it has a utility, rather than it just being, here's some nice artwork, here's a nice bit of painting, here's a nice technique that I learned. Because Games Workshop has also been very good at helping people develop techniques, which is a good thing in my opinion, it's also then taken away some of the idea of art for the sake of art within the models. But ultimately that doesn't stop the inherent artistic value of the models still existing, or the inherent artistic value that the original creators contributed to the world as a whole. I mean, you have to remember that also when it comes to the Black Library, that could also, all those novels could also be considered art. All the wonderful pictures and all the codexes and all the rulebooks could also be considered, and indeed are, works of art. But again, we see it very much as flavouring a universe. It almost has a purpose in this hobby. It doesn't just exist to hang on the wall somewhere. But I think it's probably worth mentioning as well at this point that because in some respects so much of Games Workshop's artwork has a purpose, it's very hard just to see the artwork for the artwork rather than seeing it for a reason for the hobbyist to engage with. So if I was to kind of make a mid-roll conclusion here, I think it's fair to say that one of the reasons we separate the hobby and the art is because everything artistic that goes into the hobby has a purpose. Therefore, we see it as being something which is useful or flavorful or adds something or contributes something. But that's ultimately what art does anyway. Even though in this respect here, it's about building a universe, whether it be the Age of Sigmar universe, the 40k universe, the Malifaux universe, the Infinity universe, the Star Wars universe, or if it's adding to the lore of that in the form of the novels. And this is what I think I want to conclude on this point for specifically, is that because we give it a purpose, sometimes it's hard to necessarily see it as art. But then this leads me on to my next point of what is the artist and the hobbyist. Now this is where we get to people, not just the actual things themselves. And I think this is a much easier and far more straightforward thing to summarise overall quite quickly. When it comes to the hobbyist is someone who engages with it and does contribute to it, but obviously takes largely their inspiration from inside it. And that's fine, we all take inspiration from inside it. As does the artist. The artist always does this thing as well. But the reason I think that most people don't recognise themselves as artists whilst they're engaging with the hobby, especially if you're painting, and even the authors, and even the people who are doing all the wonderful illustrations in the codexes, the reason I see them as artists, and I see everyone as artists, is because we are contributing. Even if you are painting the 89th Ultramarines army that you're going to see that weekend, even if it is yet another version of Mephiston, even if it is yet another version of Ragnar Blackmane's Great Company, and you can go on and on with all these things, that version is still personal to you. It's still a benchmark, and it is still very much an indicator of where you are at that time in your life. And even though there are some people who invent their own colour schemes, there are those also who will stick to the colour schemes that have been given out to them already, and they will go with those. And then their techniques will vary one way or another. And I think this is something which is always worth remembering as well. But here I have to use a word that I don't particularly like, but I think this is also one of the reasons why we separate the two of them. And that word is prestige. Prestige, prestige, prestige. The idea that some art is inherently superior to other pieces of art. Now, because art is subjective, it's not necessarily fair to say if one thing is better than the other. But because we have things such as Golden Demon and an Iron Skull, we have these very large scale and even small scale painting competitions that happen all the time. It turns the artistic scape into a competitive scape. Again, that's not a bad thing, it's just something that happens. And it is nice to see all the different models and all the different levels of painting that go on at these competitions. And what happens at those points is that it gives the idea that some artists are better or more valid than others, rather than seeing it necessarily as here are two artists who are at very different stages in their journey and express themselves very differently through their paints. It's going potentially, this model is painted better than this model. And actually, the next time you find yourself either at a painting competition or looking through a painting competition catalogue, either online or in person, rather than looking at it as a competition, look at it as a gallery. Look at it as an artistic collective that are displaying things. Take away the competitive element of it for a second and just see how you look at it, because it will change how you look at model painting in general, I find. And then, of course, this leads me on to my absolute final point, is that it's actually quite scary to openly admit you're creating art. Sometimes people can meet that with derision, sometimes people can dismiss it, sometimes people can simply say it's not art, like I said earlier, and all of these things can really do a lot of damage to someone's self-esteem when it comes to wanting to create. And I honestly do feel, having actually seen this happen in the past, that that doesn't help anyone who is painting. And therefore, I'd say one of the reasons that we use the term hobbyist instead of the term artist isn't just because it's an umbrella term, it's also a shielding term. To say you're into the hobby means that you can almost excuse yourself in the eyes of other people if you don't necessarily feel like you're the best painter in the world. To call yourself a hobbyist means you're not calling yourself something that you feel people may mock you for being. But at the same time, and most importantly of all, one of the reasons people separate themselves from being artists is because the idea of simply saying I am an artist can be something that may not make any sense to them whatsoever, because as far as they're concerned, what they're doing might not be art. They're doing it for a reason. But ultimately, I see everyone who picks up a paintbrush as an artist. Even if you may disagree with me on this, but the reason I say that is because even if you are doing a colour scheme that has been done many times before by many other people, and where you fit into that is down to you, you are still painting, you are still expressing yourself. Even if it is just, I like this colour scheme, it can be that simple. It can be far more than that. And for those of you out there who have done custom colour schemes, and if you know someone who's done a custom colour scheme and started one and then moved on from it and done another one, a really interesting question I'd like to pitch to you guys. Why did you choose the colours you chose? Why did you choose the angle you chose? Not in a challenging way, but just what came to your mind when you picked those colours? Was it just a decision and you liked them? Or was it maybe an ease of access thing? Because if there's one thing I've seen quite consistently over the years is that when it comes to custom colour schemes, very rarely people that want to commit to those custom colour schemes are doing it to give themselves an easy ride. They're doing it because they like the colours. Now, again, this comes down to your levels of painting and often down to the point in the timeline when you are painting, because Games Workshop paints and paints in general have become easier to use as the years have gone by. But what's really important to mention now is that as time has also gone by, the accessibility of painting has increased. So we are seeing different colour schemes, different types of paints, and different types of techniques coming in as well. And all of these things do create a far more artistically conscious community, even if we don't call them artists. But ultimately, in my opinion, everyone, like I said, who picks up a paintbrush is an artist. And we should start using the word artist more frequently, because if we don't, it tends to make the idea that being an artist is a negative thing permeate. And it's not a negative thing. Even if you are, like I said, painting a character who's established in the same colour scheme, or you're creating a whole new character with the colours that only you want to use, that's fine. And both should be equally accepted. And I think the last thing I want to say on this point overall is that for every single person who is an artist out there, who identifies as an artist out there, they've taken that step of actually saying, I'm opening myself up to criticism, to derision, to dismissal. And for those of you who are hobbyists who paint, call yourself an artist just for a couple of days and see how you feel about it. You're not opening yourself up to as much derision as you think, because one thing that I can say about artists is that artists attract artists, and at that point you start to get the spirit of collaboration going, and ultimately it makes all your work far more rewarding as well. But in any case, I always want to hear your guys' thoughts on it. What do you think about this idea of separating hobbyists from artists? Do you think it's a real thing? Do you think I'm wrong? Do you think hobbyist is a perfectly acceptable term and that artist doesn't have any place in it? Or do you think that more people are artists than actually necessarily dare to realise? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you. So those are my thoughts on the difference between the hobbyist, the artist, and everything in between, really. But let me know what you guys think below, and whilst you're down there, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. I do post my videos during the week, so keep an eye out for that. So it'll sometimes be Wednesday, sometimes it'll be Friday, sometimes it'll be Thursday, sometimes it'll be Monday, but there are multiple videos a week. And I will have a Ko-fi and or buy me a coffee page soon for those of you who want to support me casually, and for those of you who are a bit more committed, who I thank very much. My Patreon is linked down below already, but I'm so glad you watched the video to the end. Thank you all very, very much. Have a lovely day wherever you are. Goodbye, and have a wonderful day.